Hello, bug friends. I wanted to come on here and do like a little bit more of an informal video talking about the beetle bias. So this came up because of a comment on my YouTube about how the video that I posted yesterday, which is about where the order name for the beetles came from. So the Coleoptera, where that order name came from. And of course, because it's the internet, I had to be a little dramatic. And so I was like, it is the most biodiverse group. It has the most described species. And that language I tried to be very specific on. I said the most described species, and I did that for a reason. And that is because there are many people who believe that flies and or wasps are actually the most biodiverse, and that beetles actually aren't the most biodiverse despite getting this name, right? I mean, by the number of species that are described in the literature, they are technically. They make up over 20% of the biodiversity. There are numbers as low as 400,000-ish beetle species described to about 500,000-ish beetle species described, versus about Hymenoptera, so ants, bees, and wasps, I believe, are sitting right around like 160,000 described species, 200,000-ish described species, and kind of generally close to the same for flies. So I'm going to try and talk about this as quickly as possible, although every time I think about it, like, entomology is really complicated. It's like hard to do short videos about entomology because there's like, it's like Inception. There's layers upon layers upon layers of what's going on. So basically the question is, beetles are technically the most biodiverse because of the number of described species, but many people believe that they are actually not the most biodiverse. And why did that happen? And I think there has to mainly do to the biases of what we're studying. As scientists, we try not to be biased. It just happens. Like, why do we know so much more about mammals, even though there's way fewer mammals, right? You can have a psychologist on here and talk about how like people like looking at mammals because they've got big eyes and they look like us. We have a lot of people studying them because they're cute, right? Even though like if we're going to actually try and study and understand what's on our planet, right, we should have more people studying insects because they are like the most biodiverse thing on the planet. So we can see biases all over in science, and even within entomology, we can see biases, right? Butterflies and moths are part of the same order, Lepidoptera, but we know way more about butterflies. There are way more butterflies that have common names than moths do. And butterflies, even though there's fewer species of butterflies than the rest of moths, they're generally better studied. And it kind of ends up in this like pretty bias. They're like relatively large. They're easy to see. And you can say there's giant moths. And it's true, there are giant moths. And we've done a lot of studies on those giant moths. But there's also tons of itty bitty tiny moths that are like brown and super camouflaged and hard to see and hard to collect and hard to study and are no economic value. So people just don't, right? So we kind of talk about this pretty bias. The pretty privilege applies to bugs too, unfortunately. And so I think that's what we see a lot with beetles is that, you know, like just they're naturally intriguing to us. They're pretty. A lot of them are big. They're out and about. They're relatively easy to collect. And of course, there's like beetle groups that are tiny and all look the same and don't have a lot of research on them. Like I had a friend in grad school who like was reworking the taxonomy of a little tiny group called the monotomids. Like, you know, like those exist, obviously, with 400,000 to 500,000 species. Of course, those exist. So the question is, like, why do we think that? I'm going to go with wasps because that's what I've heard most, is that many hymenopters believe that wasps are the most biodiverse. But the same ideas could be applied to flies as well. Okay, so wasps have about 200,000 described species. Well, ants, bees, and wasps, the whole order together has about 200,000. I've heard anywhere between 160,000 to 200,000. So somewhere in there. Flies are pretty close to that as well. And so the question is, like, most of the big charismatic organisms in these groups have been described already. They're big, they're easy to rear out, they're pretty, they have interesting biologies. Yeah, they've been mostly done. But the problem, especially with wasps, is that most of what makes up the group are what we call parasitoids. So a parasitoid is an insect that lays its egg inside another insect, will complete its development inside the paralyzed yet usually still alive insect before eventually killing it, bursting through the body cavity and emerging as, in this case, a wasp, right? as you can imagine, that biology is difficult to study, right? Because you have to have the host. A lot of times people discover this biology for the first time because they're rearing out a butterfly and all of a sudden a wasp comes out and not like a butterfly, right? They're like, what the hell's going on? So a lot of wasps have this biology and they're just considered the parasitoids. And when I took a wasp course because I wanted to get better at identifying wasps last winter, and like studies on the taxonomy, how we're organizing these groups are so new that they're like the taxonomy is being rearranged all the time, just because like we don't even understand how these big groups of wasps are related to each other, and that's like it's if you want to be involved in new and exciting bug science, become a hymenopterist and work on the taxonomy and how things are related. And so you can see like why this would just tend to lead people to not study them, right? We're talking about like brown or black, like millimeter long critters that are just like so tiny. There's like no economic incentive to study them. They're difficult to capture. They're difficult to rear. You can see where all like the problems line up. They're like just hard to see in general. Like even some of this morphological work where you're looking at wing venation, a lot of them have reduced wing venation, or you're like dissecting out genitalia on like a literal millimeter long thing, right? You can understand why people would just gravitate to not that, literally anything else. So that's one reason, right? Is that we just have fewer people working on them and the species that are left are difficult to obtain and study. But the reason why people really think that wasps are the most biodiverse is because of this parasitoid biology. People like hymenopterists and lots of scientists in general actually believe that parasitoids, there's probably a parasitoid for every single species of insect. So if we have 1.2 million described insects currently, I mean, that's a really lowball number because we think that there's anywhere between 5 and 10 million left to go. But, all right, so like, let's just say we're working with the number we have currently. There's 1.2 million possible parasitoids. And we think that most, if not all, insect species have their own parasitoid that is just waiting to be discovered. So just by numbers, if you just calculate based on that hypothesis, obviously there's going to be way more of these wasps than there are going to be of anything else. The other point going for this theory is that even if some organisms don't have their own parasitoid, specifically, there are parasitoids of parasitoids. This is called hyperparasitism. So just like how the wasp will go into the bug and eat from the inside out and burst from the body cavity, you'll have a parasitoid of the parasitoid. So when the parasitoid enters the first insect, there will be another parasitoid that will lay an egg inside the wasp that's inside the original bug. And we have evidence that there's been up to like 5 levels of hyperparasitism, which means that there was like a wasp that is infecting 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 a bug, right? And so that level of like literal inception is crazy. So that's really the reason why people think that there's way more wasps. But again, getting to those different species and actually formally describing them is difficult for all of the reasons that I have previously mentioned. So there you have it. Beetles are on paper the most biodiverse, but there's lots of hypotheses and theories that people who study beetles and our general beetle bias are to blame, and that actually, some of these other groups, because of parasitoids and because of the lack of people who are studying them, are actually way more biodiverse. So there you have it.